Good morning. It's April the 4th. 55 years ago today, Dr. Martin Luther King would be assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee on April the 4th, 1968 at the Lorraine Motel. He'd be standing outside of the balcony getting ready to head to dinner over Reverend Cowell's house, and a bullet would pierce him and kill him. Within hours, the cities across America, many were inflamed. What has changed in America since 1968? I felt like I needed to do a special reading from a PBS NewsHour article that I'm reading or read on the internet. The name of the article is How Black Americans' Lives Have and Haven't Changed Since Dr. King's Death. The article was written on January 20th, 2020. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, while assisting striking sanitation workers. Back then, over half a century ago, the wholesale racial integration required by the 1964 Civil Rights Act was just beginning to chip away at discrimination in education, jobs, and public facilities. Black voters had only obtained legal protections 2 years earlier, and the 1968 Fair Housing Act was about to become law. African Americans were only beginning to move into neighborhoods, colleges, and careers once reserved for whites only. I was too young to remember those days. I wasn't. But hearing my parents talk about the late 1960s, it sounds in some ways like another world. Numerous African Americans now hold positions of power, from mayor to governor to corporate chief executive, and yes, once upon a time, president. The United States is a very different place than it was in 1968. Or is it? As a scholar of minority politics, I know that while some things have improved markedly for Black Americans in the past 50-odd years, today we are still fighting many of the same battles that Dr. King fought for up to the last day of his life. That was then. The 1960s were tumultuous years indeed. During the long, hot summers from 1965 to 1968, American cities saw approximately 150 race riots and other uprisings. The protests were a sign of profound citizen anger about a nation that, according to the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, was moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Economically, that was certainly true. In 1968, just 10% of white people lived below the poverty level, while nearly 34% of Black Americans did. Likewise, just 2.6% of white job seekers were unemployed compared to 6.7% of Black job seekers. A year before his death, Dr. King and others began organizing a Poor People's Campaign to dramatize the plight of America's poor of all races and make it clear that they were sick and tired of waiting for a better life. On May 28, 1968, 1 month after Dr. King's assassination, the mass anti-poverty march took place. Individuals from across the nation erected a tent city on the National Mall in Washington, calling it Resurrection City. The aim was to bring attention to the problems associated with poverty. Ralph Abernathy, an African-American minister, led the way in his fallen friend's place. Dr. Abernathy said, "We come with an appeal to open the doors of America to the almost 50 million Americans who have not been given a fair share of America's wealth and opportunity. And we will stay until we can get it. This is now." So just how far have Black people progressed since 1968? Have we gotten our fair share yet? These questions have been on my mind a lot this month. They're on my mind today, April 4th, 2023. In some ways, we've barely budged as a people. Poverty is still too common in the United States. In 1968, 25 million Americans, roughly 13% of the population, lived below the poverty level. In 2016, 41.3 million, or more than 12.7%, did. Today's poverty rate of 21% is almost 3 times that of whites. Compared to the 1968 rate of 32%, there's not been a huge improvement. Financial security, too, still differs dramatically by race. In 2018, black family households earned $57.30 for every $100 in income earned by white families. And for every $100 in white family wealth, black families held just $5.04. Another troubling aspect about black social progress, or lack thereof, is how many black families are headed by single women. In the 1960s, unmarried women were the main breadwinners of 20% of the households. In recent years, the percentage has risen to as high as 72%. That is important not because some of the outmoded sexist ideals of the family in the United States, as across the Americas, there's a powerful connection between poverty and female-headed households. Black Americans today are also more dependent on government aid than they were in 1968. About 40% of African Americans are poor enough to qualify for welfare, housing assistance, and other government programs that offer modest support for families living under the poverty line. That's higher than any other U.S. racial group. Just 21% of Latinos, 18% of Asian Americans, and 70% of whites are on welfare. Finding the bright spots. Today, far more African Americans graduate from college, 38%, than they did 50 years ago. Our incomes are also on the way up. Black adults experienced a more significant income increase from 1980 to 2016, from $28,666 to $39,490 than any other U.S. demographic group. That is in part why there's now a significant black middle class. Legally, African Americans may live in any community they want, from Beverly Hills to the Upper East Side, and they do and they can. But why aren't those gains deeper and more widespread? Some prominent thinkers, including the award-winning writer Taisha Coates and the new Jim Crow author Michelle Alexander, put the onus on institutional racism. Coates argues, among other things, that racism has so far held back African Americans throughout history that we deserve reparations, resurfacing a claim with a long history in black activism. Michelle Alexander, for her part, has famously said that the racial profiling and the mass incarceration of African Americans are just a modern-day form of legal institutional racism that once ruled across the American South. Many conservative thinkers may hold black people solely accountable for their problems. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Ben Carson, is in this personal responsibility camp, along with public intellectuals like Thomas Sowell and Larry Elder. Depending on who you ask, black people aren't much better off than in 1968, because it's either that there's not enough government help or there's too much. What would Martin Luther King do? I don't have to wonder what Martin Luther King would recommend. He believed in institutional racism. In 1968, Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Council sought to tackle inequality with the Economic Bill of Rights. This was not a legislative proposal per se, but a moral vision for a just America where all citizens have educational opportunities, a home, access to land, a meaningful job at a living wage, and a secure, adequate income. To achieve that, Dr. King wrote, the U.S. government should create an initiative to abolish unemployment by developing incentives to increase the number of jobs for black Americans. Dr. King also recommended another program to supplement the income of those whose earnings are below the poverty level, or guaranteed income. Those ideas were revolutionary in 1968. Today they seem precedent. King's notion that all citizens need a living wage portends the universal basic income concept now gaining traction worldwide. King's rhetoric and ideology are also obvious influences on politicians like Bernie Sanders, who in 2016 and 2020 presidential primaries, has advocated equality for all people, economic incentives for working families, improved schools, greater and also greater access to higher education, and for anti-poverty initiatives. Progress, you can't deny that progress has been made. It has. But in reality, progress is not visibly seen throughout this country. When you look at 50 years or 55 years since Dr. King's death, you have to wonder. You have to wonder if America truly wants, to be the country that Dr. King envisioned, that beloved community. Because when you look at the issues, 11 points of issue. Number one, Black Americans make much less money than their white peers. That's a fact. Average hourly earnings for Black and white people per hour is much higher for white men and white women as opposed to Black men and Black women. Number two, Black people are still unemployed at nearly twice the rate of white people. As a matter of fact, at every educational level, Black people are still unemployed at twice the rate. A high school graduate, a white high school graduate, is more likely to be employed than a Black college graduate. That's the truth. Number three, white wealth is nearly 7 times greater than Black family wealth. That is a fact. Number four, Black people are more than twice as likely to live in poverty. That is a fact. Number five, Black kids are more likely to grow up in poor neighborhoods than they were decades ago. That is a fact. 62% or 66% of black children are more likely to grow up in neighborhoods that are poor. 66%. That is a fact. Number six, school segregation remains fairly common in America. That is a fact. Number seven, Black-white high school completion gaps have narrowed. The percentage is still low. The percentage of adults 25 and older who have a high school diploma is up to 88% for Blacks. But when you think about it, how many of those 88% leave a school system that has failed them, being functionally illiterate? The college education gap remains huge. Black voter turnout has generally tended up for the past couple of decades. So we're voting more. 60% of Blacks voted in 2016, as opposed to 62% voted in 1992, and 60% voted in 2016. So it went down. Number 10, incarceration rates have grown a lot, and Black people have suffered much as a result of that. The mass incarceration syndrome that Dr. Michelle Alexander spoke about. And number 11, Black people are more likely to be shot and killed by police than their white counterparts. Policing a Black man, as Angela Davis wrote about. Yes, Dr. King wanted a beloved community, but America, or Americans, were not ready in 1968 for that beloved community, and they look like in 2023 that they're still not ready. Have a great day as we look back 55 years, April 4th, 2023 to April 4th, 1968.